Now to get a second view here on the John Fredericks Radio Network is our good friend Joe Rubin, longtime veteran of the State Department in the Obama administration. And Joe Rubin also now a consultant on these matters, and he's with us now. Hey, Joel, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah. Great to have you.
Thanks, John. Good morning. Happy holidays to you, too. Boy, what a new year.
This is what we're hit with. I know I had to, you're very busy today, Joel, but I really wanted to get your take. So I'm going to give you the floor. Just give us your take on this whole thing.
Sure. I'll try to be analytic here as much as I can. First of all, it was a shock to everybody watching Iran and Iraq and U.S. policy in the region closely, because this character, Qasem Soleimani, he was the second most important figure in Iran and a major regional figure for Iran across the entire Middle East, committing a significant number of hostile acts to the U.S., to other countries in the region, but nonetheless extremely powerful. It's kind of like you could call him like the top general plus vice president rolled into one. So if you imagine the Mike Pence and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff rolled into one, who'd been around for 30 years, that's who this individual was. But it's significant because of that. He's a unifying figure for many Iranians. He's a feared figure across the region, and the danger here is that it is really like a strike of a match on top of gasoline, and buyer beware, right? Like this is one of those things where I remember shock and awe back in 2003, and a lot of Americans felt like we were morally justified, we did it, we're in charge, and then there's always the day after. Well, we're now about to see the day after, and the force that he commanded is a very lethal one with a lot of spread and a lot of potential places where they can strike back. And so that's something we all now have to be very mindful of.
Joel, if you were advising the president, and as we were saying early, as you know, being in the State Department, the commander-in-chief has very little time to make these decisions because, they target somebody, they have him, they know where he is, they have firepower in the area. You've got maybe 5, 8, 10 minutes to make a decision. If you were advising the president right then and he had to make a decision, do the hit or not, what would you have advised him and why?
Well, I'll couch it as this was a target that had been seen multiple times before by Israel, by Stan McChrystal when he was in the region commanding forces. I'm sure General Petraeus saw him as well. But I think that in many instances the U.S. held back because of the unknown potential blowback, and there's unanimous disgust and contempt for the brigades that he led, the IRGC. But there's also recognition that this is something that goes in a very politically intense direction. So I would have said to the president, we see him, but what are you going to do about all of the Americans in the embassy in Baghdad? What are we going to do with our allies? How are we going to protect our business people? What is the day after plan? If we don't have that in place, one of the lessons we learned from Iraq in the invasion is if we don't have a real strong day after plan where we know what we're getting into and are willing to take the consequences and escalate if need be, which I'm not recommending, don't do this, because these actions are not in isolation. They're in a context. And that's one thing, just last thing to mention, John, is you and I know, and we've talked about this, the context is significant on Iran relations. And there's a context of a failure to have any diplomacy with Iran since we withdrew from the nuclear deal, and a lot of close calls after they struck the Saudi oil fields. Our proxies, it's not fully clear who did, but it was Iran-backed. And that context matters because Iran, the enemy has a vote, is the cliche, but it's also true. And that's you got to know, is the benefit more valuable than the cost? And there is a new commander, I'm sure, replacing him. So what has changed from their operational capacity? Probably a significant amount, but it's not as if they're without capacity. And what are we trying to get from this? And the last thing I'll say is I totally understand people who may be thinking, well, they've been doing bad things across the region and we need to push back against them. That's a legitimate point. And then the question is, how does one effectively neutralize that force? Is it solely through military strikes, or are there actions, sanctions, and otherwise, and a more coherent diplomatic policy with our allies in the region who don't like that force? And I think that the latter is something that we have not explored enough.
So the fact that they tried to surround our embassy,
yeah.
You would have done nothing? You would have just said, well, good thing they weren't successful?
No. I think that what President Trump did, and when the embassy was surrounded several days before, in the response, it was a healthy response to protecting our embassy personnel. Absolutely. And then it calmed down. Then they withdrew, and the Iranian-backed militias withdrew. And so then there was this momentary window where people were asking, what are we going to do next? Is there a way to push the Iraqi government to move Iran out of its politics? Is there a way for the Iraqi government to for us to deal with Iran in this context? But then the strike has occurred, and the embassy surrounding is different from this strike. So now my fear is that if there is another, and I think already I've seen reports that we're evacuating our embassy personnel, which we did not do several days ago when they were surrounded. I think there's recognition by State Department officials and others how this can be something where the Iraqi government may ask us to leave the country. We don't know, but I don't think we consulted with any of those who are affected by this, and I think that we're now we kind of President Trump owns this decision and the consequences for it.
So why was General Soleimani in Baghdad in the first place?
Well, analytically, again, he's been going back and forth for years to Iraq and other countries in the region to build up pro-Iranian militias, terrorist organizations, allies, political allies, you name it. He's been their point man, essentially, in the region. That's why he was there. It's not something that we, the United States, like or support, but there was a part in the fight against the Islamic State, against ISIS in 2014, 2015, when he was also there, and they used in Iraq space, they used Iraqi pro-Iranian Iraqi militias to defeat ISIS. It's one of these small, weird windows in national security where the United States and Iran, sworn enemies, let's just put it that way, had overlapping interests to defeat the Islamic State terrorist organization, and they were both fighting the Islamic State in a similar battlefield. Mm-hmm. Not exactly coordinating, but also recognizing shared interests. And that was part of his work there. He was specifically, at that moment, my understanding, at the airport to receive and greet the Hezbollah commander of Iraq, who is, I believe, Lebanese. And look, it's not that they were up to good things. I'm not saying that. Were they up to an imminent attack? Were our forces about to get bombarded again? That's not clear. I think the president needs to explain to the American people why he is claiming that this was an imminent attack prevented. There's a lot of unknowns here. And I have to say also, he didn't, and I'll put on my congressional hat, the White House didn't notify Congress of this. And Congress has been pretty clear about its fear of an escalation in U.S.-Iran military activity, including the House on a bipartisan basis. Matt Gaetz co-authored an amendment with Ro Khanna, the left and the right, to oppose a war with Iran without congressional authorization. That did not get included in the final defense authorization bill, which is where they were trying to get it attached. But there were 30-something Republicans, supporters of the president, who said, you need authorization. Well, that didn't happen. And that's going to be significant. There will be a lot of debate right now about where the president's taking us on his own. And Congress is the sole war-making authority in the United States, and I think they should be included. They represent all of us.
Well, okay, but we're still going on George Bush's act of 2000 that they've never never had the balls in Congress to bring it up for a vote, right? So they're still acting off that, and so they're to blame themselves because the war power, the ability to call war that Bush got in 2001 or whatever it is, has never been even brought up on the floor for debate. I've had this discussion with scores of congressmen and senators who say they're going to bring it up, and Ryan bags it, or Boehner bags it, or now Pelosi bags it. So,
what they're talking about is bring it up to repeal it. Their 2001 authorization for use of military force exists. That's against terrorist organizations like Al Qaeda. The 2002 exists. That was to attack Iraq during Saddam's time. There have been ongoing efforts to repeal those because there's been a fear in Congress that those would be used as justification for launching a war against another party that wasn't originally authorized, like Iran. So there have been efforts in Congress to require authorization for war with Iran. The president hasn't even asked for authorization. But this is an Iranian, right? There are proxies in Iran, organizations supported by Iran that are not Iranian, that they have in the past argued could be terrorist affiliated. Fine, I get it. And the IRGC, which she led, is designated a terrorist organization now by the administration. But this is an Iranian official, the leader of the strongest military wing, and the United States struck and killed him, and the president did so without authorization from Congress for that attack against an Iranian military figure. And that's, I think, where members of Congress are going to say, where's the authorization for attacking the leader of a foreign military, even if you've designated it as a terrorist organization?
We're with Joel Rubin. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and adjunct faculty member at Carnegie Mellon's University, Heinz College, Washington, D.C. campus. He was in the Obama administration. Like me, he is an anti-interventionalist, and now we're debating this issue with the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, who Joe Rubin has said would be like taking Secretary of State Pompeo, Mike Pence, molding them into one. That's the significance he had. But I guess my question is, if you've got 10 minutes, if you're President Trump in Florida and you've got 10 minutes to make this decision, are you really going to get on the phone and call up, Steny Hoyer, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch? You're not going to do that. You're just going to make the decision. You got to make a decision one way or the other. So that's number one. Number two is a lot of us have been talking today that this reminds us, those of us are a little bit long in the tooth, of the Reagan strike on the Gaddafi household compound, where he injured Gaddafi, killed his wife and his son, and injured his daughter. And that was the end of that. Gaddafi, you never heard a peep out of him again. Can you relate those two? Is there any similarity to those?
Well, I really hesitate to draw direct analogies between events that are so disparate. Something in the 1980s of a dictator who was a tyrant in his own country, but did not project the force like this. One could, that was an argument that was made about taking out, Saddam Hussein, that would do it. We hit him, hit his kids, everything would be fine in Iraq, and we saw how that ended up. So I really hesitate on that one. I do think, though, also there is, and I managed legislative affairs for the State Department with the House of Representatives when I was in the Obama administration, and the House was controlled by then John Boehner and the Republicans, and there was an ongoing dialogue throughout about what we were doing in the region, and a notification process that I think has totally collapsed in this administration. And so you're right in saying he don't pick up the phone and call the congressperson 10 minutes before a strike, but it should never have gotten to that point where the president, his team, they should be briefing Democrats and Republicans on the national security committees alike on a repetitive basis about what we're doing in Iran. Because this is not like a new thing that just showed up yesterday. This has been an ongoing. We had, as you recall, a very close call back in June after the Saudi oil field strike. And we have had debates in Congress for months about whether or not to get authorization for striking Iran. So this is nothing new. And I'm concerned about how there's a lack of recognition and awareness of the critical role that Congress plays on national security, oversight, appropriating funds, and providing wisdom and guidance, too. Sometimes they have a perspective. The chairman of Armed Services, Inhofe, has a perspective, and Adam Smith, a perspective that is a bit more global sometimes from I
guess, Joe, my frustration is I have been calling. I've been on the air almost 9 years. For 9 years, I've called for a reauthorization of the AUMF. 9 years. I've talked to at least 50 representatives, senators, and congressmen about calling this to the floor and having a debate, all right? They're all for it. It never happens, right? The last time it was, I think it was Barbara Jackson Barbara Lee out of Oakland or something, slipped it into the appropriations, right? Slipped it in there, and then Paul Ryan bagged it and shot it in rules. This has been going on for a decade, and so and why don't they bring it up? Both sides of the aisle, feckless and cowards, don't want to debate this issue, Joe, because they don't want to have the responsibility. What they want to do is get on Fox and CNN and complain that they weren't informed after the decision is made. If they wanted to be a part of it, they'd get AUMF on the floor, authorization for military force on the floor, debate it, and it would go up or down one way or the other, and have to go on the record. Am I right?
You will not get an argument from me on anything you just said about the inability of and fecklessness of Congress, frankly, on this issue. No doubt. There are significant progressives and conservatives who want that and have not been able to get that done. But again, I bring it back up to, if the Trump administration had made that a priority, they probably could have bent the conservatives to support what the House had passed and what was being debated by the Senate on the defense bill recently. But that's a process question. I think we're going to deal with it. But going to the bigger strategic question is, we all have to ask ourselves, what is President Trump trying to do right now on Iran?
Right.
What is his objective?
Right.
And if the objective is to, as he has said in the past, pressure Iran to come back to the negotiating table on its nuclear program and other bad behavior in the region, he may have just terminated that possibility. And that's the big question for even his biggest advocates of his maximum pressure campaign. That is a sanctions policy. He's now bent over into another position on Iran that tells the Iranians that he has a military policy towards Iran. And that, I think, is where we now bring in these questions of Congress and authorization, but also for all Americans, our servicemen and women. Remember, just one tiny last nugget, Iraq is about a third the size of Iran. Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq in population. And we had 150,000 troops sent into Iraq to invade the country. We have 5,000 sitting in Iraq, and barely, a couple, 10 or 20,000 in neighboring countries as defense. So the dynamic is completely different. Are we prepared?
No.
Are the American people, do they want that?
No.
And that, I think, is the president needs to explain what he's trying to really do right now.
Answer to every one of your questions is no, 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 and super no. I mean, the Americans are not prepared. I mean, going to war with Iran, you're so right. This is not like Iraq. I mean, they have 1/3 the population that we do. It's a 2,000-year-old Persian civilization. I mean, you just go. Yeah. I mean, and the naive. I think it was Tom Cotton, another neocon moron, who says, "Oh, you know, we drop a few bombs on them, it's over in a month." I mean, they got 1/3 of the people that we do. I mean, what planet did these people live on? These neocons is beyond me. Look, I agree with what the president did. I think you have to draw a line in the sand. I agree with you also. I hope they've thought through the next steps on the chessboard, but certainly an escalation that would lead to ground troops and tanks going into Tehran is like beyond anything that I could possibly imagine, and would just end in complete and utter disaster. So I hope we're not going there. But, you know, maybe they're getting the message, Joe. We'll have to see what plays out.
We'll have to see. Yep.
Thank you, Joe,
it's a
for
new
your
day.
time. Thanks, Joe, for making time for me.